We'll start the recording after that comment. What'd you say, Shayna? You're about to
I
talk
was
shit.
just going to add that Ernest is very particular about the terminology of cannabis, Donna.
Well, you
Yeah.
could just stop at the word terminology. I can be very particular about terminology, period. Why do we use words if we don't care about how they're being used, right? Like, there's no point in having them. Okay, so here is a thought experiment. Einstein was really big. Other figures throughout history were really big on creating experiments in their own mind because you didn't always have instrumentation and subjects, and some of the shit they were interested in was just straight up illegal at the time. So you would have to do it in your mind. But so Donna, I want you to imagine, do you remember your teachers throughout school history? Okay. I want you to consider
Elementary school,
elementary school. Okay.
middle school's a blur. High school is half and half.
Okay. I want you to consider intellectually your third grade teacher without thinking of their name and without imagining them. Ah, that was the face I was looking for. I love it. Thank you, Donna. You can't. That was perfect. The look on your face was just priceless. That was the perfect. You've already probably thought of their name. So
Well, I thought of the name the second you said it. What did you say? Intellectually, but without.
Well, no. So I want you to consider them. I had to use that word carefully, without thinking of their name.
Yeah.
And without imagining them, without visualizing them.
Right. So I did those two things immediately. You said them too late. That's how quickly I did them. And so then I was going, okay, if I'm not going to imagine them, so I had to remove that. I had to remove their name. And then it was just about how they made me feel, how I felt when I was with them.
Yeah.
Was the place that I went to, but I had to excise the other two first.
Of course. So I want you to consider, and I say consider intellectually, because that's, because you can't think about them because I don't want you to use words, right? And I don't want you to use imagery when you consider the first president of the United States. Too easy, huh? The name instantly came into your mind. Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't have a good concept of that.
Yeah.
So it's really just what I've learned. And as soon as I think of all the things that I've learned, I know that those are bullshit. So I have to think about what it would feel like during that time, what it would feel like.
But that still requires imagination because you're going back to that time, right? Yeah. So that leads me to my point, is that anything that is removing you from the present moment in your own cognition requires imagination and language, or. Does that make sense? Does that simple point?
And data, cognitive data, yeah.
But so for example, I can consider this plant without words and without imagery because I can see it. And by imagery, I mean imagination. I don't need I'm fucking looking at it. I don't need to imagine it, right? So anything in my present moment, I can consider logically. I can have deduction, reasoning, inference, all without words and all without concepts and all without imagination, essentially, which is memory and imagery in our mind. So if it's in the present moment, you can interact with it with all of your spectrum of cognition. Does that make sense? Yeah. So if you're walking along a road and you see that a tree has fallen, you can logically deduce, and you don't have to have a word in your mind. You don't have to imagine the last time that a tree fell in front of you, but you can still logically deduce that there is a blockage in the path and that you need to go around it. And you could even come to an elegant solution, whether going over or under or around or removing the object without verbal cognition and without imagination. So to interact with your present moment, those two things are not necessary. They can be there, right? You can put them there, but they are not necessary. Is the group with me so far? I want to make sure that this is really clear because this really cuts to the core of everything that we've ever talked about in a manner of speaking. So if you are in the present moment you're considering something in your present moment, which is Qigong, which is the bridge mindfulness system. That's what you're doing. You're considering aspects of your present moment. You can access all of the other aspects of your cognition at the same time. If you chose to, if you needed to, if you wanted to, if the desire is there or whatever. However,
You mean because you're not firing those synapses, so they're still available? Is that what you mean?
well, I'm saying that imagination and concept aren't necessary when something is in your present moment because you have your sensory perception to process it and to interact with it.
Right.
Right. However, if you are doing anything outside of the present moment in your cognition, so what I'm saying is thinking usually is the number one thing that is removing yourself from attention on the present moment above the threshold of active recognition, then you are using concept and words or imagery and imagination. Does this make sense to the group? So when you're thinking about your problems, when you're trying to figure something out, when you're comparing and contrasting, when you're wondering what's going to happen, considering what's going to happen in the future, regretting the past, all of this requires at least those, if not both of those elements, one or the other. You're either imagining something in the past, and that's not usually the way that people interact with their cognition. They will on occasion, but usually it is in words and concepts. Does that make sense? So everything outside of the present moment relies on words, concepts, and imagination. Does this make sense?
It does. And the trick is, for me, because there's always cognition there. I mean, it's rarely none.
Well, unless you got knocked out.
So,
Someone punched you and you're in a dreamless sleep. Yeah.
uh,
Well, even then, there's a form of cognition occurring because your heartbeat. You muted yourself, Donna.
it's
Yeah.
just not to go down a rabbit hole about it. Like, for instance, I have a junky room that I have to clean out where I have all my papers and my crafty stuff and whatever, the guest room.
Mhm.
And I have to get ready for tax time. So while I'm sorting through the pile of papers that I just made a pile of papers in the desk area, ones I need, ones I don't need, ones that go in a file, ones that go in a pile for the tax guy. So it's a challenge it's not a challenge. It requires focus to have just do energy, maintain my points of attention and think about those things with the least amount of cognition as possible to get the task done, as opposed to going down the rabbit holes of, wow, it's really been that long since I had my shoulder surgery. Oh, it's, oh, I wish I would have done this sooner. I could have, whatever, without the rabbit holes. Yeah. So especially when you're doing something that's task oriented like that, you really have to maintain your points of attention firmly because you need cognition to do what you're doing. So you want to avoid you want to maintain the balance in a way that you choose.
Mm-hmm. So I'll draw an illustration. So I have a circle. I need a bigger circle for this one because I got to put some stuff inside it. Okay, so we can look at this as human cognition in the mind. When we're doing our Qigong practice, or maybe you're doing a little bit of bridge technique, whatever, our mind is going, our attention and our cognition, and Donna's example, in the room that she's organizing and cleaning. So outside of the bubble is the world around, oh, it's in caps. The world around us. The moment. Now, this is what it would look like if you were practicing Qigong. And I would actually for me, I could put up to 8 arrows at a time. The idea is to have at least 1 arrow at all times. Does that make sense to the group? This is the human mind, and attention are these arrows. That's what the arrows are. They represent attention. And the attention is on the outside world. Maybe here I'll put Qigong points of attention. Maybe it's shadows. I conveniently stole that from Carlos Castaneda and Don Juan. Maybe it's the Dantian. I conveniently stole that from Tai Chi. Maybe it is on the sky. That's one I made up myself, called Breaking the Horizon. Always keeping attention on the sky whenever you're outside. And then maybe this point of attention is breath, just for fun. We'll say that this person is aware of their breath as it occurs. You would say that the sky is happening now. The shadows are happening now. The Dantian exists now. You're paying attention to something that exists in your environment. The breath is occurring at this moment. As you're talking, as you're breathing, it's all occurring now. Does this make sense? Is that a clear picture? Okay. Well, with what's that? I heard somebody.
I said yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Shayna. Now, with what Donna and I just spoke about, that any thought or any consideration of anything outside of your present moment requires words and imagination, or usually both. And I'm going to make one circle bigger than the other because people are far less imaginative than you might think. So this is our thought bubble. Now, why do you think I didn't draw these circles outside of the bubble, outside of the big circle? Why is imagination and thought inside?
Because the mind is where it happens.
It's inside the mind.
Yeah.
Right. So now I'll draw what common cognition looks like. And this is just a picture. So it is very flimsily going out and simultaneously very flimsily going in to highlight these two things, because they're thinking about what they're going to have for dinner. They're thinking about how they're going to attract that perfect mate, their soulmate.
And by flimsily, you mean those static lines are less direct and purposeful. They're just
exactly.
They're just like random blocks tumbling down in some habitual, repetitive way. Right.
Below the threshold of active recognition, meaning that the mind is a leaf at the mercy of the wind. It is going where it has been most habitually trained to go. Whether that is sounds or, of course, I look at it biologically, whether we're looking at somebody we find attractive or something that we find attractive. So the mind goes habitually. It's usually based around the destroyers. You'll notice that. The mind, when it is below the threshold of active recognition, is going to highlight the 4 destroyers. Does that make sense? And those are rabbit holes. That's exactly what we're talking about by traps of thinking. Because when the mind is habitually below the threshold of active recognition, entertaining these 2 things, we remove ourselves from the moment as it happens. And that is one of the first enemies of knowledge, which is distraction, because we're too busy in our own mind making shit up with thought and with images. Nothing wrong with thought, nothing wrong with images.
Stories, the stories that we tell ourselves about everything.
Stories that we tell ourselves, absolutely. And how is the self-importance projected? The stories we tell ourselves about ourselves.
It's the center of everything.
Absolutely.
We are the center of every story.
Yes. Well, I know what you mean. Yeah. Does this make sense to the group so far before I continue? Because I'm getting into, why do we call it traps of thinking? What is a trap of thinking? What is occurring physiologically when we're lost in thought? Attention is not purposefully going out into the world. It is going in. And that creates a fundamental imbalance in the human condition that has caused the vast majority of all suffering on earth, physical and especially psychological. Now, not all physical, because you may, you get old and whatever, but a lot of our physical suffering comes from our psychological suffering. There would be no such thing as war without psychological suffering. That's the reason that we have war. There would be no such thing as crime and murder if we didn't have the insanity of psychological suffering, because it is not beneficial to the species for us to kill ourselves in the way that we do. So it is a form, literally, and I don't want to tiptoe this too much with this group. It is insane. It is the definition of insanity. We keep doing the same thing again and again and again and again, and we've been doing it for thousands of years. As a species we have, and that's the fifth destroyer. We don't talk much about that. So the traps of thinking are traps because our attention is inflating them and giving them so much of our energy.
Could you put the picture back up,
Sure.
please?
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that instead of our attention being the arrows, which is the above recognition, attention, which is the way attention is designed to be, and is we all have that capability, and that we all have the capacity. All it takes is intention and will to direct our attention deliberately, which is above active recognition. But what's happening is in addition to those squirgly leaf at the mercy of the wind lines and those bubbles of thoughts and stories in our heads, our attention is focused inside that circle. And that's all below sometimes our imagination can be above the level of recognition.
I'll draw that circle next. I'll draw that next. So here's what the practice looks like, and that's kind of where Donna was going. If we're doing our practice, there's very little, and I'll just erase it, because if we're really doing it, especially if we're in hydrostasy, there's very little that is below the threshold of active recognition. Now, there still is, because we're always operating with both, right? The human brain fundamentally operates above and below active recognition, but the greatest imbalance in the human experience is the imbalance of operating below the level of active recognition, which we call feeding the nemesis.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put those two circles of thought and imagination back up. And the bigger one, and this is going to be my circle. So I'll give you an example of what mine looks like. Especially yesterday, before today's class, I really wanted to really dig into my own practice. And this is my thought bubble. And this is my imagination bubble. But it's not leaf at the mercy of the wind. I'm using thought to help point back to the sky. I'm using imagination to help point back to the breath. That's this practice. Does that make sense? And that's kind of where, I think Donna was going to go next, is that our imagination can be deliberate. Our thought can be deliberate, and it can all be above the threshold of active recognition. Does this make sense? And this is another way of looking at your lens of perception. What are we doing with our lens of perception throughout the day? Is it shining on the world, interacting with our environment, or is it simply lost in a never-ending rabbit hole of thought? And that thought is usually attempting to control, attempting to manipulate, trying to figure things out, comparing and contrasting. One that I don't talk about as much, but I used to do a lot, which is imaginary scenarios. Habitually, below the threshold of active recognition, entertaining imaginary scenarios, which were usually based around very below the level of active recognition desires, if that makes sense. So the traps of thinking that we focus on first in the Qigong system is basically a way to help you relax around the practice, because you don't have to evaluate your thought. That's what some people will do when we first started to create this system. people were like, well, how do I decide? How do I know when my thoughts are going to help me solve my problems? And how do I know when thoughts are erroneous? So I created a basic way of looking at it, and that's the first three. Is it repetitive? So that's even more insane, is that these thought bubbles that we're creating, a little bit of imagery, because that's how you imagine the past, or that's how you imagine a future. The only way the past and future exist in your mind is a memory or imagination. So it's like a memory moving forward almost. It's just imagination. But those thought bubbles are repetitive. So we're creating the same thought bubbles as we did yesterday, and as we did the day before, and as we did the day before. If you're leaking power, those thought bubbles are, I can't, I'm not good enough, I don't know how, there's no way out, poor me, poor them. Those are typically the leaking power thoughts. And hopefully with this system, those are the ones that we start redirecting right away. In counterbalance. In counterbalance, that's when we start redirecting the mind back to what? The practice, those arrows back to the moment at hand. So those thought bubbles, though, first of all, are highly repetitive. Has anybody else noticed that? Has anybody else noticed that the thought bubbles in your mind that you're giving your energy to, typically below the threshold of active recognition, deliberate intention, and will choice, is highly repetitive?
It was the first thing I recognized. Oh my God, how many times have you thought that same thing? And what is it doing for you? I mean, how is it serving you in any way? And you're just cementing it in, and then even populating that story with more details of things that didn't exist. You just have decided they've existed. You start remembering them in a different way because you've populated that data with more information that validates your story. It's so stupid. It's the stupidest thing, but it's the most common thing that I said to myself in the beginning of, I still find myself doing that. I'll go, that devil's advocate voice. I'll go, is that true? Like, why do I think that that's true? Who said that that's true? That was just something that was automatically there. Every time you thought this about it. It's not necessarily true. It's just a matter of habit and momentum. Like that's not even, you don't even know if that's true, whatever true means. It's just the way you remember it. That's all. Over time. And you've created that memory.
Exactly. So I'm assuming that for most of us in this group, we can agree that the vast majority of thought bubbles that we're in, the thought bubble that you put in a picture, that's happening, that's inside the brain. And so the vast majority of the thoughts that we're thinking to ourselves, and then that will look like that first picture that I drew, because it's not outside of our mind. It's inside. It's all inside our own skull is where all of this is occurring. All the words and all the imagery, which is required for concept that's removed from the present moment. Now, how about habitual? How often is our little thought bubble a habitual response to stimuli? When things don't go your way, do we think a certain way? When things do go our way, do we think a certain way? When people offend us, do we think a certain way? When people cut us off in traffic, do we think a certain way? When people don't treat us how we want to be treated, do we think a certain way? What'd you say, Shannon? That's not true. He doesn't think anyway. He just, yeah.
Well, he's obviously taking offense at something you're saying, so it must not. Maybe it's just what he's saying to you. That's not true.
Yeah,
I don't do that.
You guys heard him, right? You could hear him.
Yeah.
Okay, that's so cute.
I have to tell you that the more in this class, the more that I just allowed myself to question myself, because it's such a conditioned habitual response that I didn't even identify it. I just think I don't do that. But if I do it, I mean, once I thought about it, or once I reflected on it, or once I became the watcher of my own mind, I was like doing it all. That's what I did to find meaning, to find, like, anytime anything happened, I needed to categorize it, label it, put it in a box, make a story about it so that I could have an understanding before I could even move on. And then I needed to tell that story later. Um, so a lot of the stories I would end up telling in class was, oh, I never, and then that's how I processed fact and truth. And I thought I was really good at that. Like I was on the money with a lot of things. I mean, I could be wrong, but not really too far off. And when I realized how often I do that, and I would just allow it to exist without um, doing that, it was amazing to me how little I really know about anybody or anything that's happening in them, with them, through them, and even what they're retelling me, how much of that is any information that I actually need, or can that's just them speaking from their experience, doing what they do in their heads of what I am working on not doing in my head. That's really all that's going on, you know. So it was disorienting at first because it's like, oh, if I don't do that thing that I always do, then who am I actually, and what is really happening? Um, but it was also a relief because so much of that is just noise, 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 noise that gets in the way of everything else.
And one of the things that it gets away in is our opportunity to access the totality of ourselves, because we have many different layers, many different aspects. But if our mind is habitually, constantly, repetitively, for the vast majority of the day, entertaining thought bubbles, there are all these aspects of the human condition, the human experience, that we are almost completely cut off from. There's some that we are completely cut off from.
I also had to stop looking at other people doing it to me. You know, oh, are you still dating that guy? And I was like, what guy? Who was I dating when I was talking to that person? Oh, Richie? No, we don't date anymore. And they go, oh, I'm sorry. You'll find someone. You know, when it's right, you'll know it. And I always thought, like, do I look like I'm missing an appendage or something? Do I ever appear unhappy to you when we have like it's all good. You know, you needn't worry about me not having not being dating someone. It doesn't invalidate me, but I don't say those words. But I just started when I started giving up my own thought streams. I became so aware of everybody else's thought streams about me. You know, they're like, oh, wow, they have a whole scenario about me that doesn't exist.
Yeah. That subject can come back up in hunting power to a certain extent. But yeah. Okay, so we have repetitive and habitual. And who here thinks it's a good idea to think thoughts to yourself that make you feel shitty? Is that a sane thing to do? That weaken your own energy, that make you feel terrible, uninspired? Is that a good, and that's what the repetitive and habitual thoughts will eventually lead up to. It won't make you feel well. Yes, Michael.
But they're programmed in.
Programmed is a funny word because we're not a computer. I get it. The human mind somewhat resembles computers because the human mind created computers. I think a better word is that you are habitually conditioned yourself. It's not programmed in. That sounds like Michael is programming Ernest's brain, or Donna, or the man, or the mysterious and undefined they are doing.
The media,
Yeah.
your parents, advertising, they're not actually programming you, but they are,
But
because
they
you
are.
willingly do so, but you don't realize that you willingly do. Once you realize that you allow it and you can choose something different, well, then they're not doing it to you anymore. But that's a big realization.
But ultimately, it's because the mind is below the threshold of active recognition. You are far more subjective to, or you're more influenced by the things around you.
I'm still surprised. On occasion, I am still surprised that there's a certain path of synapses my brain goes through about how I feel about something. And I go, wait a minute, where'd you get that? Like, that's just something you thought for as long as you can remember.
Yeah.
You can think something different. Like those still come up for me. And,
Right.
and I notice them and I go, holy cow, like that's a whole operating system of belief about a certain group of things that you still are doing, even with years of practice, without that was happening under the threshold of awareness.
Right.
It amazes me.
And I, for the most part, I'm okay with the word programming to a certain extent. But as Lauren pointed out, sometimes when we say that, we're not recognizing the below the threshold of active recognition. Michael, you have programmed yourself. It is your mind. It is your recognition. You're either easily influenced because you're below cognitive active recognition, or you're not so easily influenced because your mind is impeccably aware of the present moment. It is much more difficult to lead you down a path if you're more present, if you're more aware of everything that's occurring. You see these dynamics. You see people subtly attempting to manipulate you or trying to convince you of something. And sometimes when we say programming, especially the way it is in social media, the way I see it on Facebook and Instagram, it's an excuse. It's basically saying that, the mysterious and undefined they have programmed me, and now I just need a new programming. I need a download or some shit like that. Okay, that is a way of talking about things, but that's not an accurate representation of what's occurring, because it takes away what we're doing, our action, right? Our role in the dynamic is being removed. We're not recognizing that it's because our mind is in a habitual state almost all the time. We're so easily influenced. I made a response, and it's probably not going to be received well, but it was somebody who was talking about desire. And, I think they're a sex coach or something. So of course they want you to indulge in your desires because that's how they're going to make money. And whatever, I don't care about that. That's not, I don't look at that one way or the other. But desire is almost always unreliable for the vast majority of human minds, because they've been existing below the threshold of active recognition, that all their desires are being influenced by the four destroyers. Look at your desires. You will find biology, you will find social construct, you will find the habits that you've created already, and you will find entertainment, because the mind is bored and at odds with the present moment. That's why I've isolated those as the four destroyers, because when the mind is below the threshold of active recognition, that's the program that we're creating. Let's not get that confused.
Right, but we don't have to figure that out beforehand. That's why we always say, and I'm speaking just to Michael's comment, he's right. There is a conditioning of the mind that has occurred, but we've been a willing participant in it. We just don't realize that we are doing it. We're allowing what's outside of us and what's being told to us to become our reality. We've accepted it as so therefore we think that way because we believe it's right, whether it was our parents or, I took my stepson to the circus. No matter how horrified I was at the circus when I was little, took my stepson to the circus. And then I realized, after all of those years, going, why did I take him here? This is a horrible place. And now I'm going to be like a activist against the circus, because that's what I should be doing. And that's what I became at school. I really literally got rid of the circus trips at school, because I was such a pain in the ass about it. And I was like, prove the value. What's the educational value of taking children to this? Like, what are you teaching them, as opposed to what they're learning that we don't want them to learn? And I knew the teachers that were taking them, it was just kind of like a blind following the what everybody used to do before. It's, oh, that's a fun school trip. No, it's not. And what are they learning? They're learning about what? Wheels, and they had some bizarre, reason that they put on the paper about why they're taking them to the circus. So anyway, all I'm trying to say is, back to the practice, because when you start practicing to whatever degree you're practicing, where are your points of attention? What are your thoughts? Are they habitual? Are they repetitive? Are they not making me? The more you do that, the more I'm still seeing things, and I'm practicing every day. I really do. I rarely find a day where I'm not practicing at least 50% of the time. Rarely. I don't even know if I can remember when I wasn't practicing at least 50% of the time. And I still will go, I'll hear some story in my head, one of those circles you drew, and it's so embedded in there that that stimulus leads to that synapse, leads to that synapse, and that story and that thing so many times that I'm like, wait a minute, what was that? That's just something that happened. You are making a deductive assumption about, I don't know, everything in this category based on what? Just because you thought it a million times before? And how is that serving you? It's not. It's a big black hole, a big black line in the middle of my thought process where I am operating below the level, the threshold of recognition. That's all it is. I have just narrowed the space for me to populate my data deliberately by thinking that thought over and over again. So it doesn't matter whether it was programmed by the man or by the media or by the about by ad or about the what success is and what a family should look like and whatever. It doesn't matter. It matters that I can change that, and the way that I can change that is just to go back to the practice. There might be a lot of habit and momentum with that one, but I'll be more apt to notice it if I just go back to the practice. I can't make it complicated. I can't go, oh, I was doing that and see what society did, and I don't have to follow that rabbit hole. I just have to notice it and go, well, would you look at that? Where are your feet? Where's your breath? Where's your dantian? Where's the light? Where are the shadows? Whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense to me. So ultimately, so far, we have described that when the mind is below the threshold of active recognition, we create thought bubbles around concept that remove us from the present moment because time is an intellectual exercise, memory or imagination. So what happens though is that these thought bubbles create other thought bubbles, and that's why we call them rabbit holes, because you go so far down this rabbit hole that before you know it, we come up with who knows what kind of shit. It's all kinds of shit. So this is a fun experiment as well. So when we first started, we did a little bit of a thought experiment. Here's another little bit of a thought experiment. Imagine that somebody has just given you the one sentence, and we've kind of joked about this before, but Michael, you can play along. Let's say that we give you the one sentence that just is the most wise, brilliant, all-knowing, all everything. It is the sentence. It just, everything is just, it clicks together with that one sentence. That's cool, huh? That's a nice idea to think about something like that. Now what? So I've given you that, or not me, let's say an angel comes down and gives you this knowledge in words, the information. You don't have the experience yet. That's something different. They give you the most truthful, most accurate words that you've ever heard. It's the sentence of all sentences that just makes everything understandable, right? In this thought. Now what? Now what do we do? What do we do? What do we do with it? It's a trick question because we've already heard the sentence. We already know. Everything that we need to know is already rattling around up here, but we're too busy chasing those rabbit holes because of habitual conditioning. Because we're below the threshold of active recognition, we're so easily influenced by one of the four destroyers, which is the habits you have created already. You will drive.
They're such black holes too. They're black spots, because they're spots where no fresh, new, deliberate, creative thought can exist, because you can't have both at the same time. So they're just resistance we throw in our own. I know you don't like that word, but it is resistance we throw in our own way. It's an obstacle to what we're working to achieve. And it doesn't have to be so dark. Once you notice it, it's a win. It's like remembering, remembering and forgetting. It's a win when you go, holy cow, look at that. And because it's such a freedom to to be deprogrammed. It's a freedom. It's more space in your brain. It's more space in your existence.
Yeah. And that's I'll get, what's that first sentence you use? I'll use that way before I use reprogrammed. You said resistance. The way that I look at resistance is cognitive. Because we're creating those thought bubbles, the energy does not flow, because it can't flow because we're creating a blockage, a cognitive blockage that is causing all of the human psychological suffering on Earth, which leads to a lot of physical suffering. Michael, did you have a comment?
Is resistance one of the four destroyers, or
No, resistance is a word I don't use very often because the way that it's used among the spiritual community is just completely erroneous. I don't look at it that way. Resistance is usually when something is like a thought is coming at you. We could use that for it, or a punch is coming at you and you want to resist it with your own energy. You're using force against force. That's one way to look at resistance. Resistance, the way that it's commonly looked at, is just whatever is displeasing to you, whatever you don't like about the moment right now. Some people would call that resistance, but it's used.
No, I think of it when you draw the picture of the laminar flow.
Yes,
and how everything flows through that tube in
yes.
a flowy way.
Right.
Those habitual repetitive thoughts are like I think of it as an artery with the cholesterol clogged up on it. It's a resistance that collects in that, and it causes a disturbance in the flow. And
Yeah.
there is that laminar flow cannot exist because it cannot go past those habitual repetitive thoughts that are in the way. So those make it turbid.
And a word that I prefer is interference. It's interfering with the flow of energy. But the way that people might usually use the word resistance is, let's say I'm trying to pull you somewhere you don't want to go and you resist me. You're actively resisting against. Or let's say that I tell you that something you don't want to hear and you resist it. You're like, no, that's just not true. The sky's not blue. It's not blue. I can't accept that.
Different definitions of the same word.
Those are different definitions.
If there's a big sock stuck in the leg of my pants and I go to put my leg in and I'm like, why can't I push my leg through? What's stuck in here?
Right.
It's my sock.
But the reason,
resistance.
Sure. The reason I don't use the word is because 10 times out of 10, when the word is used, they're not talking about the laminar flow. They're not talking about interfering with the natural flow of energy through the body and, in our environment. So because it's not used that way, I don't use that word. But it has nothing to do with me liking it or disliking it. It's just another word that I don't view as applicable as interference and non-interference. So you're either interfering with the flow, or you're not. And the way that you don't interfere with the flow is to connect with your environment and clear the thought. You have to be able to create gaps in the overall amount of cognition for the energy to flow smoothly, which means shrinking those thought bubbles almost to non-existence. Unless it's a deliberate act that you're using thought for some sort of purpose, such as organizing or a creative thought that will help you communicate. And I do talk about that in the counterbalance phase of Qigong. I list productive thoughts, as long as it's not out of balance, as long as it doesn't become a stream. So if I have an aha, I'll write it down, or hopefully I remember, but I don't want that to become a stream that interferes with the present moment. Does that make sense? It's interfering. That's why it's non-interference when we go to our practice and the thought isn't interfering with our present moment. Does that make sense, Michael? Resistance is a word I will almost never use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think of it just, if something comes up, then sort of like our intuition can come up and tell us what to do, or sort of decide that it's a good way to move or a good way to act or a good way to think, and then we don't do it. So like we're resisting what naturally comes up.
That's a way to look at it, but the reason that you would be, it's not an active form of resistance, it's a habitual tendency. So you can have an inner guru comes up and says, hey, don't touch that hot pan, but then the habitual tendency, you just go right back to it.
So what are the four destroyers?
The four destroyers are a result of a mind that is below the threshold of active recognition. So first, before telling you what they are, That's the reason they're there, is because the mind is in habit mode. Michael, if your mind
Right.
is in habit mode, I can convince you to buy the most ridiculous thing. You know, I can convince you of some of the most ridiculous things because we're below the threshold of active recognition. Does that make sense?
That I get, yeah.
Okay. Because of that, there are four things that have gotten wildly out of balance in the human experience. Number one is our own biology. Sometimes we eat in ways that are insane. We interact with sexually in ways that are absolutely insane. We'll do things to our body that just doesn't make sense. And it's because of the nemesis. What is the nemesis, Michael? A mind that is below the threshold of active recognition means there's no practice. Well, they're conditioned and they're being conditioned, and it's all because of the condition of their mind, which is habitual. Does that make sense? Attention is just going all over the place like a water hose.
Yeah.
So it's just waiting for something to grab it and pull it along, and it happens. Inevitably, attention will get grasped onto something, and it usually thought bubbles and the world around us.
Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah.
So the biological destroyer, and we'll have a whole session on this. This is coming up in the 20 topics where I talk about the destroyers. But the biological destroyer, the social destroyer, why do you want that Ferrari? Why do you think that money is so important? Why are we giving movie stars so much attention and time? It's like, yeah, you made a good movie, but why do I care about anything else? Like, why am I chasing after your name on a piece of paper? Like, what the fuck? What am I going to do with that? Like, why does that matter at all? And it, you know, maybe we give it a little bit of matter, but it just has so much momentum. So does the no, so that was biological and social. The social destroyer, why do you want a big house? Why do you want a fancy car? Why do you want a career that pays money that you'll never be able to spend? And if you do spend it, what kind of imbalance are you indulging in at that point? Indulging is something we'll talk a lot about in hunting power. Indulging is a form of imbalance, and you can do it for a little while because we can be in an extreme for a little while. We're very dynamic creatures. But if you exist there, if you stay there, and if it's below the threshold of active recognition, it will gain unconscious momentum. And before you know it, we're trapped, and it will cause suffering. That's the principle. Balance is power. Out of balance, it will cause suffering. You may find a new balance, but you're going to get there in a very inefficient way. It's not ideal. So do those first two destroyers make sense, Michael? Biological and social. Social destroyers, you know, why do men look at women the way that they do, you know, as caretakers of the house or whatnot? That's a
Fashion
thing.
Fashion is a big one.
That's a huge one. Yeah.
I spend way more money on getting my hair colored than makes me comfortable, but I haven't let go of that yet.
I stopped
It's
getting
definitely one of the destroyers.
Yeah.
So social, and what was the first one?
The first one was biological.
Biological. Yeah.
The vast majority of human behavior is a complex mating ritual.
Right, based on the need to procreate and all the aspects.
No, they don't even want to procreate. They just want the pleasurable.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I know. Yeah. I got you.
Yeah.
No, but it's all based on that.
It is based on that.
It's in
evolutionary biology. Yeah.
Yeah, almost like a perversion of that or something. Yeah.
It's not a perversion so much as it's an imbalance.
Yeah.
You can be as perverse as you want to, Michael.
Yeah, once you start keeping score about it or holding yourself against some standard, you know, how many times a week does this couple have sex? We only have, you know, sex this many times or whatever it is. Have I ever done this or have I ever done, I can't die until I've had a threesome or whatever, you know, whatever thing. It's not there's nothing inherently wrong with the desire, except that if it's like you said, Michael, programmed. Is it a thought you've thought a million times? Is it because you're trying to solve a problem? Is it because you're comparing yourself against some other standard that has nothing to do with? Is it a thought that's operating below the threshold of active recognition?
So, yes, Michael, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I got it. So biological and social.
Yes, and to answer Karen's question, where does talking a lot fit into the destroyers? That's the next one. Well, and they're in no particular order, of course, but the habits that you have created already, those will continue to be driven if we're below the threshold of active recognition. And you may notice that a person who thinks all the time feels compelled to talk all the time. Have you ever had a moment with somebody where the silence felt natural, as opposed to 9 times out of 10 where the moment silence feels very unnatural?
Yeah, even with myself.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. I notice people just talk to talk. They don't
Yes.
want that silence.
No, because the mind is never quiet. So they just feel compelled to, and notice what the talking is usually about. And it's not always, but it's usually removing them from the present moment. Oh, what so-and-so did, what Lauren did, and what Michael did, you know, and then we're othering at that point.
Or even describing experiences
Oh
nonstop.
God, yes.
Oh my gosh.
But describing experiences will require memory and imagination and language. So that's our thought bubbles. And Karen, when you rewatch this video, I really described in the beginning what is occurring, the dynamic that's occurring when attention is inflating the thought bubbles.
Thank you. I'll watch that. Yeah, I missed it. Thank you.
Yeah, Ernest, it's making me think of a guy that I met yesterday. I met him before, but yeah, it's just like the thought bubbles are constantly going off, and he's verbalizing it, and he's letting us know about how he got transferred. His manager stuck up for him. He was accused of something and talking a certain way to women, and talking a certain way in a racist way, and talking a certain way, and he was accused, but he says no, so he's denying it. But in the 4 minutes I was talking with him, he explained how he was culpable. Like he basically repeated all that type of language in that conversation within the first 3 minutes. Mm-hmm. He was like, women are this, and this one's that, and this one's that, and racist comment here. And then he like spewed the stuff that he was being accused of and being transferred for many times as security guard. So he like completely, and I tried to like just stay with him, slow him down a little, and just explain, like, it's 2022, you know, we can't be like, it's not Goodfellas, like you can't talk like that, you have to, and I just tried to like stay with him a little bit, but he was like kind of, I don't know what the word is, but he was a bit challenged. He was a bit tripped out.
It's just spewing. It's just spewing the thoughts that are going on. It's just giving a microphone to the thoughts that are constantly going around in his head that he's thought a million times, and the story that he tells himself about it. But yeah,
he had a little bit of like One Flew Over the Nest going on, like a little bit of that. So it's like it runs in a way that it's hard to stop him. Like it just goes almost as if he's sick over it.
I feel like that when my mind was like that. I noticed that.
It's how we feel. I know this guy is a little bit more though. He just keeps talking. Like it's
sure, like everything to degrees. But the principles are still the same.
Yeah, it's exactly how we feel. Exactly what you're just saying. I feel like that too, and so that's what I wanted to say. I noticed this aspect of what you're talking about in myself with this guy, and his name's Mike also. And and the other people around me were like, you know, you're trying, but let it, like, don't even, like, it might be past the point, because the guy like is what I would call challenged, like maybe it's slightly mentally challenged, like something like that.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you label it.
He's lost his ability.
To degrees.
It might not matter, right? That's what I felt, that he's really there to connect with once he was like connected.
As long as you see the principles in it and you reflect on whether or not you are doing that or want to do that, and it leads to you thinking thoughts above the level of recognition, that's all you need to get from that experience, right?
Yeah. But so I took it as a self-reflection also. And I just looked at it and sort of what you're saying, like, yeah, that's how I feel. Well, that's what I do sometimes, almost, using a lot of thoughts and words to resist the moment.
Like having 10 browsers open at one time and you don't ever close them. You're just hopping back and forth between them.
Yeah. I noticed a lot of switching, a lot of switching of attention is one of the blocks. All right, so we're on number 3. What's the 4th one?
So we had desires that we're creating already. We had biological, social. which one am I forgetting? Biological, social, the habits of creative. Oh,
Entertainment.
yeah. And so entertainment is included. And William Miller asked this, I think it was William Miller, but someone asked the question like, well, so are my forms of entertainment to destroy or not necessarily? No. Entertainment itself isn't an issue, just like biology itself isn't an issue. And none of these destroyers by themselves are necessarily an issue. It's because of the nemesis that they become
Balanced.
unbalanced and habitual conditioning. I'm trying
Because
to
of the
use your
nemesis
word.
now? I was gonna
Remember-
say because of attachment.
No.
Is that-
And attachment is a result of an imbalance, which is the result of the nemesis, which is a mind that is below the threshold of active recognition. Because if you're actively recognizing the moment, you're far less likely to exist in an extreme, which is where extreme attachments occur. So
Right, that makes sense. Yeah.
Buddha said that suffering is a result of attachment. Attachment is the result of existing in an extreme. So it is existing in an extreme that causes the suffering, that causes the attachment, that causes the suffering. And so what was the destroyer we were just talking about? Oh, entertainment. So because the mind is bored and at odds with the present moment, it requires insane amounts of stimuli to keep it feeling well. Like it just needs all of that stimuli because it is conditioned. It has been, I won't use the word programmed even, to coincide with your words, but basically the mind, because it is below the threshold of active recognition, requires all of these different things, exterior, more thought bubbles to keep itself entertained.
I used to have to, in college, I used to have to put on, not have to, I did it in elementary school as well. I was so conditioned to entertainment, to having entertainment for my focus, something external to catch my attention, that I would have the TV on, perhaps the radio as well, the stereo, whatever, in order to study, so that I could focus. I needed the distraction so that focus would become a point of attention that I could do without my mind wandering. That's how active, with the browsers open, like on the computer, I needed to. And also I have so much going on that I would nap. Like the more intense the pressure was, I would take a nap to quiet my mind so that I could wake up and start over with the ability to focus. My roommate, who I'm still friends with in college, has pictures of me laying on the floor with a stack of books next to me, of course, cramming because I procrastinated all the time, for a major exam, big, thick tomes next to me, taking a nap on the floor because I needed to take a nap to quiet my mind so that I could focus. It's just crazy.
Right. Does that one make sense, Michael? There's a gate in hydrostasy that I call dream walking. Dream walking is a mind that is neither bored nor at odds with the present moment. Therefore, there are no problems. They're free from all of that. The burden is completely lifted because of lucid living, lucid mind in the moment.
And there's a characteristic of dream walking that I didn't realize until I did it. And I didn't try to do it because I didn't know I wasn't doing it. Was that I stopped narrating. Even walking along the beach and not having a million distractions, I still was narrating my experience. All beautiful, wonderful, creative, artistic thoughts, but I was narrating. I was narrating the birds, I was narrating the ocean, I was narrating my walk, I was narrating my points of attention. And when I stopped narrating, there was a whole bunch more space available. But yeah, I still had I had a story I had to tell with me as the center of it. And that took up space. And you can't dream walk. And there's no dream walking if you're narrating and you're the center of the. You're just telling a pretty story. It's nice. I didn't have a million things going on. I wasn't as distracted, but I realized I was narrating. Like, why do you need to name and label all of this? Anything.
With that said, ironically, I actually recommend narrating your practice to yourself in the beginning. But in hydrostasy, we're in a different dynamic now because we're maintaining a point of attention all day long. We do not forget our point of attention. And because we don't forget our point of attention, the practice gains even more momentum to the point where we can create gaps in the overall amount of thought, and that includes narration. That includes creative thoughts, because creative thoughts can become an imbalance. Is creative thinking by itself an issue? Of course not. But if all you're doing all day long is sitting there thinking of creative thoughts, you're going to find yourself in an imbalance that will cause suffering. What will that look like exactly? I'm not a fortune teller. I don't know. But for me, it just equaled a whole bunch of ideas that I just don't have the time and energy to do all of them. And so it kind of feels like butter spread over too much bread, and you just feel really thin. So that's a personal example of how that suffering felt, but it could feel different for everybody. But the principle is it will result in suffering. Okay, so let's finish up with the traps of thinking. So the thought bubbles that we're creating are going to have, what's the word? It has characteristics. So the characteristics that we've thought about or that we've outlined so far, one is repetitive. And I will probably misspell repetitive, repetitive, I don't know. Habitual. 3, not making me feel well. And I like to say feel inspired / well. Okay, and then the Qigong practice has a break, and we don't revisit this subject until warrior training. So in the counterbalance training, all we're going to focus on is repetitive, habitual, and not making us feel well, because quite frankly, that's enough. But we will look at other types of thinking that will almost always at this stage in our lives and in the world will be a rabbit hole, will be a point of cognition that is unproductive, leading to cognition that is just straight up insane. Does that make sense so far? And it will all still be repetitive, habitual, and not leading to inspiration, but we can be even more specific about the types of thoughts that we're thinking and whether it is beneficial, and ultimately whether it should be redirected. Now, the good thing about Qigong is it should be able, if you do the practice from basic alignment to hydrostasy, it should help set up your hydrostasy practice to where dream walking becomes more accessible. Creating gaps in the overall amount of thought becomes more accessible. I can give you specific things to deliberately modulate to, because we've been setting it up through the rest of the practice, such as appreciation. We start setting up appreciation right in the very beginning of the Qigong practice. So when you get to hydrostasy and you're able to clear your thought, you can very easily access and modulate to the feeling of appreciation. Does that make sense? So there's going to be things that you can modulate to that have nothing to do with Qigong. That's fine. But I will help with certain things that we can modulate to as a result of the practice. Does that make sense? Appreciation is just one of them. Okay. Any questions about anything so far? Maybe we'll have time. I'll share the ultimate goal of Qigong and the ultimate goal of hydrostasy. All right, so here are some of the other traps of thinking, and I may have forgotten one, but we don't have Jerry, our note taker, here. So trying to figure it out. Oops. I'm just going to list them all now. This is all of the stuff that our brain is doing that is removing us from the present moment, that is repetitive and habitual and doesn't really make us feel well, and that will only lead to further insane avenues of cognition. Ultimately, it will never lead to adaptability. This is all taking us away from our ability to adapt to challenges in the present moment. And trying to understand is really similar to trying to figure it out. The reason I differentiate them is because Trying to figure out maybe something more in your immediate environment. Trying to understand might be something that is more trying to understand why we're here. Like, what is the moral of the human story and all that? Thinking about your wants and desires. And I know my law of attraction people aren't going to like that, but it becomes a habit. It becomes a trap. And you'll be 100. No, you won't make it to 110. You'll be 75 years old and still thinking about your wants and desires. The moment you manifest your wants and desires, you think about new wants and desires. It's just a habitual trap. Imaginary scenarios. This is you imagining yourself punching your boss. Imagining yourself, and again, is imagining yourself winning the Heisman Trophy bad? Not necessarily. But when it becomes a habitual, repetitive thing that is below the threshold of active recognition, it's very likely a habitual imaginary scenarios, and it's not going to lead to anything beneficial.
Is problem solving trying to figure it out?
Sure, we'll put that in addition. So we'll put trying to figure it out / problem solving.
Because my tendency was to make everything something to be solved.
Sure.
This is an issue. So I have to think about it more. And the more I think about it, the closer I'll get to the solution, which is not true, but that's was a trap of thinking for me, certainly.
Sure. And this isn't the complete list, of course. I'm sure we can figure out others, but these are kind of the main ones I focus on in Qigong. And then when you're in the end of your warrior training, we will narrow the thought down. And what are these traps? It means redirect using the rule of 3. If you find yourself going down these traps of thinking, you have some options. You can be passive and allow it to continue. You can try to exercise force and try to push things away and try to resist what's occurring. Or you can simply redirect. You can redirect back to your practice, multiple points of attention, using internal dialogue to talk out your practice and go back to maintaining a point of attention. Does that make sense? And then ultimately at the end of warrior training, I would recommend redirecting any thought about yourself or other people. You don't need to do it.
Right. Can you bring the board back up, Christian?
Yeah. And that is going to be tricky. And that's why warrior training is because it is a complete commitment. It is an all-out affair of your mind. And at that point, you're ready to embody. So warrior training is definitely a step up from counterbalance. Counterbalance will definitely make people feel better, but this is the path to freedom.
Okay, so let's just for a second, I understand the counterbalance to the warrior training is different, but just for a second, we're in the warrior training and something comes up with regard to other. Others not treating me something, or others cutting me out of something, other is seeing it differently, and so it's not going in the way that I envisioned it. And that sort of
was the example you just gave us, Mike. You came across this guy, you were using him as an example of you were noticing the principles at play in this scenario, so you brought it to the truth. But then you started to go down his rabbit hole of, and then he started proving his own problem, and you could see why he got fired from all the jobs, because he was. And then I tried to explain to him that we can't talk that way in this day and age anymore. And so then that's othering. You know what I mean? Because, well, we're trying to control, we're trying to help him change his behavior, we're trying to show him what he's doing, and then you stop noticing the principles and became part of that path with him.
Also, Ernest, you had mentioned something about, like, if I'm sitting with somebody and they're really nervous and uptight, although they may say they're calm, rather than focus, I stay focused in my bubble of perception. And that's helpful not to get caught up in that, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, excellent, because I'm understanding what you meant by that.
Another way to put it, Karen, is that you maintain your awareness and your attention above the threshold of active recognition, and you're
Okay.
less likely to get pulled along by other people and how they feel.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
But let's
And
go
I
back.
get stuck with that one, Karen, a lot because it's, as a nurse, I'm trying to affect change, and that's force.
No, I don't want to
and-
affect change. I have to stay present in
Right.
myself.
And
Yeah,
that's why
I
Ernest
can't affect
says-
change. That,
When we ask
that's
Ernest to
force.
teach something, he always says, but nobody asked that question yet.
Right.
So I'm not teaching that because nobody's asking the question. So he doesn't go on to the next thing if the group is not there. Why
Oh,
talk
I've
about
learned that
this?
quite well, not to give advice. That's
Right.
that's wasted energy, my own.
And typically it's either it is a habit, but it's also a part of self-reflection and self-importance. When somebody
That's so
when somebody offers you unsolicited advice, what do they do? You didn't ask for that. Why would they on earth offer it's because I care about, no, it's because you're trying to project your own righteousness, your own self-image onto other people.
And there's no right or wrong.
Yes, and
It's
to
just
feel
that at
good.
some
I
point,
feel good. I made them feel better. Yeah, it's all
Exactly.
self. Yeah.
and there's nothing wrong with, it's not about declaring war on anything. It's just about illustrating the point of, we can boil all, when you get through warrior training, you can really boil it down to, what are my thoughts? Are they about self or other? And that's
Because
what
it's one
you're
of those
doing.
two.
That's
Yeah.
what you're doing in those circumstances. So we all do it, but yeah.
And then Michael, let me entertain your scenario. So let's just say, for example, so I got your scenario and there's these things going on in your life and, you know, things aren't working out. But let's say that you're thinking about it and you're thinking about it and you're thinking about it and you come up with the answer. All of the sudden, that one sentence, that thought that just organizes everything, puts everything together, it all makes sense. Now what? Are we done, or is there isn't there action? Isn't there something to be done?
Right. Usually, right. I was gonna say there's action. Yeah.
So we don't think ourselves, you know, in and out of all of these scenarios necessarily. There's physical things that are occurring, right?
Sometimes.
Well, almost always. So if we talk about devil's advocate, let's say that you sit there and you think and you think and you think and you think about thinking and you think about what they're thinking and you think about what are all the ways that I can manipulate the future.
Yeah.
All the ways that I can make things the way that I want them to be. That is manipulation, that's trying to control, all of that stuff is occurring.
Right.
But let's say the sentence occurs to you and you have this aha idea. What do you have to do with an aha idea? Don't you have to do something with it?
Put it into practice.
Right?
I think you have to go and experiment with your new knowledge.
You have to do
That's-
something with it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Experiment's a good word. So we have to experiment with our new knowledge, and let's use knowledge the way that we use it in the bridge. Information, experience of others, and personal experience. So Ida's kind of saying, okay, we got some information, our mind organized some stuff, but now we have to take it from the mind and put it into the world, and that requires action, focus, intention. So you have to go back to the practice anyway to make all of that come to fruition. Michael, what people are doing is they're hoping to think themselves in and out of everything.
Right.
That somehow, and remember at the beginning I said, imagine the one, and we're just imagining, like I know you don't have the sentence, but the one sentence that just explains the human experience, tells us why we're here. It gives you purpose. It gives you meaning. It makes everything fit together, right? That one sentence, an angel comes down from the heavens and says, Michael, this is the knowledge. This is the information that you need. And now you have it. Now what?
Now you got to do it. That's where that seems easy. That happened to me. They flew in from the Chicago area and
Oh, I thought you were about to say an angel.
yeah, Yeah,
Okay.
it's true. And
Okay.
4 angels. Even
Four
Lyle
angels.
was an angel that weekend and
Oh,
flew in
Lyle is
from
never an angel, Michael.
and flew in no and flew in from Chicago, and we had a workshop on it and gave me then handed me the knowledge. And now I'll look at it and I'll say, and what happened? Why not?
How has your
And the
practice
an-
been
and
since?
yeah, and the answer is resistance. It comes up and we follow. So we don't have to. You're saying you have to. You don't. You literally can resist it. We literally can choose not to.
You
I'll give
can
you a
think
bet.
about it more.
Yeah, you keep thinking about it. I'll give you a better example. We can act it out differently. We can act from a place of conditioning, and sometimes we can act it out. I mean, I see that. I've done that.
Well, remember, if you're not actively above the threshold of recognition, meaning that your mind is deliberate, you are always acting out conditioning, not sometimes. What are you doing? If you're not being deliberate
that's the thing. Yeah, that's the distinction from today is the
above or below active recognition. Yes.
That's a great point.
Just to look to where you're targeting, where are you with respect to that concept. That does make sense. But I'll give you another, like, we take on knowledge all the time. Like, at this point in my life,
we take on information all the time.
I basically understand from a few different things I've been in and from life that, chicken probably is carrying a lot of stuff that I don't need. Milk, or not just milk, but like milk always makes sense. Cheese, right, doesn't make sense. Veganism is probably better. It's just take it as a tenet for a second. I've learned that in my life at this point, and still, I love cold cuts and bread and sugar and chicken, and now let's put hot sauce on it. And I'm an American. It's how I was conditioned. It's in me. But I have learned that I'm probably much healthier in another way.
Learn.
So
in what form?
Yeah, exactly. I don't
you have information.
choose. I don't choose necessarily to. Sometimes I choose those type of choices, but it's not something that like embeds in me to the point where like, oh, you learned that, go ahead. Like, you have to literally choose to follow it.
There's something else involved, and I'll help you with that in a second, Michael. So I'll help clarify that, but let's round up.
That's a great point, because force, clarify that.
Yeah, I'll clarify that. That's getting into behavioral change, and we'll talk about that more in hunting power and in hydrostasy. And I only talk about that, or it's only a part of your practice when you're maintaining a point of attention. Otherwise, you're never going to, it's impossible. What I'm going to talk about would be absolutely impossible if you're not practicing. So that's the caveat. That's why I don't talk about this as much, because if a person's not practicing, it's not possible. Like, what I'm saying requires a practice. So that's a caveat, but I will talk, I can talk about that here in a second. But so ultimately in warrior training, we can recognize that almost all of the thought that you're thinking, Michael, is in relation to yourself. It's just about your self-importance, about your desires, about what you want, you all the time. Self-care doesn't require thinking about ourselves. I can take a hot bubble bath and not think a damn thought about it. So self-care and thinking about yourself all the time are completely unrelated. They don't rely on one another to exist. Does that make sense? I can care for myself. I can do my yoga, and I don't have to think a single fucking thought about it.
That makes lots of sense.
So thinking about yourself is not required to take care of yourself. Thinking about yourself is a habit. That's it.
Yeah.
And it gains momentum whenever we're below the threshold of active recognition, meaning you have no practice in place.
As a matter of fact, it can get in the way. I know that after a result of my back injury, I have to get stronger. I need a stronger core to hold my chiropractic adjustments. It makes sense. It was told to me. I can feel it. I can feel the imbalance of it. It makes sense to me. So, but for me to prescribe, I'm going to go do a boot camp so I can get a strong core is counterproductive. And so my self-care becomes this whole thought and this whole training and this whole pattern and this whole thing. And I'm not listening at all to my body on what it needs and whether it needs rest or whether it needs how many repetitions or how far I can stretch or it makes no sense. It's just me prescribing some behavior on myself that gets in the way of me taking good care of myself.
Mhm. And I'm willing to say at this point, every single person here has all the information necessary. You don't need any more information. When we come to these classes, when we come to group studies, it's energetic support, helping us organize and helping us remember. But I have revealed very little new shit over the last 2 years or 3 years. Like, it's the same stuff. Deliberate modulation, sensing energy, and the act of alignment. That's not new. Like, that was day one stuff. I might have changed the words a little bit because of the world and the way that they interact with language, but okay, so this all makes sense. Above, below, active recognition, warrior training is, what do we do when we see ourselves thinking about ourselves? We redirect. Redirect to what? Back to the present moment, using at least 3 points of attention, including the voice of power, and then going back to maintaining a point of attention. Does that make sense? The redirection technique of the rule of 3. So I'm not just saying that these are traps of thinking and good luck, like go do something. No, I'm saying when you identify this, that's called cognitive attention training. You're aware of your own cognition as it's occurring. And then you utilize your sensory attention training by paying attention to your senses on purpose to bring you back to the present moment and above the threshold of active recognition. Does that all make sense, Mike and everyone else? So that's what we're doing. That's what the traps of thinking are all about.
It's day one stuff. Here I am. Where is my mind? And did I put it there?
The only difference is, when we get into warrior training, we're remembering more than we're forgetting. So Don is talking about remembering 50%. Then we're in the warrior training, or at least a person would be ready, in air quotes, for warrior training because they're remembering more than they're forgetting.
You have to identify what remembering and forgetting is. That was just foreign in the very early beginning stages. But that's why I'm enjoying these Tuesdays, because going back to the beginner practice, now I have, being in warrior training and practicing hydrostasy, the remembering and forgetting have different elements to it now because as a result of my practice, but it's still all about remembering and forgetting. It really is. It's very simple. We talk a lot more about the nuances and the subtleties, but it's all the same principles that they haven't changed at all.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I started, I guess that thread or that question, I said, take it from counterbalancing or warrior training, but just start with warrior training. And I sort of just jump to that. But the difference is whether you are doing whether you are present in your here I am, where's my mind? If you have a point of attention, as Ernest just said, that's the difference. You've already checked. When you're doing warrior training, you've already checked the box and saying, look, I get it. I am doing this to myself. I am. So you're throwing that out you're taking that as a tenet. You're acknowledging that and you're saying, this is why I'm practicing. You're in the practice.
Right.
Well, it's not just the acknowledgement.
I'm probably doing that from a counterbalancing place and not from a warrior training. I am a warrior and I'm not training or something like that. If you want.
Exactly. Warrior training, you could look at, you have the information. And because of counterbalance, you have some personal experience. And because you come to class, you get shared experience. You have all the knowledge you need. Everything you need to know about the entire fucking universe, you know. But now you got to do something with it. And that's the practice.
Right. So there's no getting it, really. The getting it is the practice. So the reason why you feel like you get it more as a result of warrior training comparatively to counterbalance, it's not that you're getting it more. It's all the principles are still at play. It's just that the result of practicing clears your lens of perception so that when you start from the beginning again, you're seeing it through a lens that is less clouded by, that's why we're talking about interference and resistance. There's less interference. Your lens of perception has less of those thought bubble things in there, those programming, as you called it, Michael. There's less of it there, so you can see it through a different lens of perception, which makes going back to the practice more accessible, which
Right.
makes your ability to discuss the nuances of the virtues of the practice easier. That's all. It's not leveling up. It's not getting it. It's just you're seeing it through a lens of perception that's less cloudy because you're practicing and you have a degree of practice in habit and momentum in seeing the world deliberately. And so your lens changes over time. That's the only difference. And you can cloud up your lens. It's not once you've cleared your lens, you're in a new level. You can cloud up your lens with your thoughts. Just the same way you got to the point of a cloudy lens, you can get back to a cloudy lens in moments. It's just that it becomes less desirable to do so. And so you have embodied and made a commitment to the practice because it's a preferred way to live.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now we're going to jump to hydrostasy, and we're going to do some.
I thought you were going to say we're going to jump to group cuddling at that point.
That would be difficult on Zoom. Okay, I've saved this whiteboard. Any questions about any of this before I move on? And then that'll be the talk.
You said you saved it, right?
I did save it. Yep.
Okay.
Okay. So, Michael, this is what we're talking about, and this is what will be required for behavioral change. When I talk about non-resistance, I think the word that works best is the word, and I'm just muting you for background noise. You can unmute when you're ready to talk, but I talk about the word interference. Interference from what? This is also a difference between the way that I present things and the way that a lot of other things present things. Because I don't look at chi, I don't look at energy as accumulation. I have more, you have less. I'm going to store it up and set shit on fire. I don't look at things that way. I look at it as flow. We are a conduit. We are everything. The whole world, the whole universe it's all in me. It's funny when I hear people talk sometimes because they're rabbit holes. Michael, have you heard that the universe loves me? Have you heard people say that the universe loves me?
Yes.
Well, that's really easy to type on the internet when you're in the comfort of your own home. But have you ever noticed that when you're not, the universe is trying to kill you?
Is it?
Is it? I don't know. There was just a 7.8 earthquake in Syria. 5,000 people instantly extinguished from the face of the earth. The universe loves them.
That's a great point. I've heard the universe has my back. Oh, really? When that falls on you, does it really have your back?
Yeah, the universe has your back. You can last approximately, I think about 4 seconds in the vacuum of space before you're frozen. Okay, that's just for fun. I just threw that in because I could. All right, so just imagine that this is flowing smoothly though. The whiteboard, it's a little tricky to make these lines like perfectly smooth. See, I can't do it. But so
it's the torus effect. Yeah.
We can call it the torus effect. We'll call it the torus effect, Michael. What interrupts this flow of energy between, you could say in Chinese, it would be heaven, earth, and man. I don't like man, so I'll say human. In between, the conduit of energy. But this box represents the human being. And so I'll draw that. This box represents the human. What do you think interference looks like? What is interference? What is interference, Michael?
It's like energy blockage in many forms.
Be specific. I just want to know, what is interference? What is the number one form of interference in the human experience that interferes with this natural flow of energy? Thinking. Bottom fucking line. It is thinking.
Donna gave me the answer on the chat earlier.
Oh, dang it. This is binary. So we could say infinite and we could say finite. We could say heaven, we could say earth. We could say this and we could say that. The way that we describe it is really not that important. But it's basically the human being is the segue between the binary. what we view as binary. The universe itself is not binary, it's infinitely dimensional, but the brain is hardwired binary, so we require context. A synaptic connection is either firing or it's not. That's a 0 or a 1. So we have the human being, and this is a natural flow of energy in this picture. In this picture, a human being is connected to the moment. There's no cognitive interference in that picture. I know that my lines are a little bit squiggly, but that's just a flaw in my hand. Does that picture, that representation of the human being that is not lost in thought, they're not feeding the nemesis, therefore they're not feeding the destroyers, they're present, they're mindful, they're deliberately intending their point of attention, and they're actively recognizing themselves in the moment, self-awareness. Does that picture make sense, that representation, before I move on?
They're actively recognizing the direction of their mind.
Of their mind, of their attention in that moment, absolutely. But there's also aspects that are below active recognition. That's why there's balance. Because there's always aspects to our cognition that's below active recognition. Reflexes, for example.
That makes sense. And even thinking about that flow is blocking.
The moment you think about that flow, you have started to interrupt that flow.
Yes.
Absolutely. You can use thought to point, but it's still interrupting the flow. It can help point back to the flow. Yeah.
Yes.
And if you're using thinking to point back to the flow, it's still constructive, it's productive, because it's pointing towards your practice. So does this picture make sense, Michael? Because this is answering your question involving behavioral change. So it's for you. I want to make sure you understand it. Okay.
Wait, is there a picture?
Yes. See this picture? That is a human being that is above the threshold of active recognition. They're practicing whatever they practice. It could be Qigong, it could be something else, but there's no interruption. There's no interference in the connection. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes.
That creates what I call the hydrostasy effect, the feeling of balance. And this is called hydrostasy. And I also borrow the word that Anthony Robbins uses, that Carlos Castaneda used, that Napoleon Hill used. They call it personal power. Now, the reason the word personal is so important is because it does not imply manipulation or power over something. Does that make sense? That's an important distinction. It's not power over anything.
No, it does. It's personal power. Yeah,
it's the feeling.
I've sensed it. It's the state. You put
it's a state of being. Yes. Yeah. Now, what I would say is that it feels like knowing. Oops. Not belief, but, and this is why you wouldn't need to defend it to other people. You wouldn't need to prove it to other people. You wouldn't even need to prove it to yourself, which is what people are usually doing in their own mind. They're trying to prove shit to themselves using information and thought. You wouldn't need to. You just know damn well. You just know it in the fiber of your being.
You can feel it. Yeah, you can feel it.
Well, at this point, there's no cognition interference. So
no, not that type feeling. Right.
Yeah. So everything we're talking about in hydrostasy is feeling. So we've jumped into the hydrostasy layer of practice. And what the section of hydrostasy that I call hunting power does is it helps to focus this process even more. Now, if you want to drop a habit, if you want behavioral change, you need to do one thing and one thing only. Increase the flow. And when I say increase, these are just words that we use to help describe. It's not more than, less than. It's just how visceral is that flow? How unobstructed is that flow?
I like that word, Ernest, visceral.
Visceral.
Feeling, sometimes when you use the word, not you, but people use the word feeling, they think emotion.
Emotion.
Visceral feeling.
Because the word feeling is usually undefined. What are we feeling? Feeling is the word for perception. We're perceiving something. If you're perceiving an emotion, then you're feeling the emotion. If somebody's slapping you in the arm, you're feeling that slap in the arm. When you are balanced with the world around you, and this is the word's alignment, we are aligned to everything else. the Tao, if you want to use the Chinese terminology, the way the universe moves. We're aligned to way everything else. Well, you are supremely adaptable, and you feel it's a balance between expansion. You feel expanded into the universe, and yet there is this infinitely dense point in the center of your being, a hint located in the Dantian area, that is infinitely dense and strong, like iron, like steel. Does that make sense, Michael? Increase that, and you will drop behaviors that don't serve you. It's a process. It takes time. You're not trying to force it or control it. One day you'll wake up and you'll feel so much personal power that you're like, you know what? I don't need that extra chicken.
As a result of your practice.
As a result of your practice. This isn't hydrostasy, so that should go without saying, because hydrostasy is practicing. You have a point of attention all the time.
Yeah.
That is the entry point to hydrostasy. And then eventually you have 4 points of attention at all times. That's called the 4 directions of attention. So does this make sense, Michael? This point makes sense. This isn't.
It does. It does. And then all of the training does. And then when you get down to the example and you say the chicken, it sort of does, because to me, like grilled chicken with broccoli rabe and a little bit of garlic bread is like what I used to think of as healthy, like because I was eating grilled chicken instead of fried chicken. So just within the example of chicken for a second, it's so specific to the conditioning that it's a little confusing. I do understand what you're saying.
Because you said that's what you thought of as healthy.
Yeah, I was just using your example.
That's what came to my mind too. What were you thinking about the chicken?
Like walking into a deli, like when I'm ordering the grilled chicken versus the frilled, I'm in New York, right? I don't know, but I'm just saying, like we've got great delis. We walk in, and if I'm getting the grilled chicken version of it versus the fried chicken version of it, then I made that healthy choice. So it's like that's what's ingrained in me from growing up, whatever it is. And it's not, I get it. I'm not a computer, so it can be redone. But that's where there's like level confusion there. Well, and that's just one example. The chicken thing is just a very light.
Before you walked into the deli, where was your practice before you walked in the deli? Where was the practice when you opened your eyes that morning? Where was your practice? It's 2 degrees, and it's directly related to how much you're embodying your practice, and that's it.
And we're talking about hydrostasy, Michael. So we have to talk about it as if you are maintaining a point of attention at all times. Otherwise, we're not talking about anything.
Yeah, I was going to say, point that out.
That's a caveat. We can't talk about personal power or non-interference if you're not practicing. So the only reason
it's like when I play, I jump into the video game 2 feet all the way in, and that's where
it's called indulging.
No, it's not just that. It's something a little bit different.
Skipping steps.
No. I have like I don't want to be self-indulging in what I'm going to describe. So when I was describing the person before, like that was a little tripped out, and I wasn't really coming from a place of control. Maybe that's what was happening, but it was different. It's like a genuine, like I actually care. So I'm like, I have like a sweet aspect to myself. I think we all do, but that I have tapped in with. It's a little bit, you could call it pushover. I mean, I've been called certain things over the years, but I actually care. So I like come from a different, genuine place there, and then typically let down by like what Ernest is describing, like the straight self-importance of people, or where it's, and I'm typically like, and then I'm like a sucker again, like, they did the same thing again. And I sort of like was naive about it, but I actually live there. I put 2 feet in, and I live in that place of naivety, even though I already know. So that's my work.
Well, but we can't keep going back and forth. So you just went back to not practicing. And so we can't talk about hydrostasy and personal power and non-interference and changing the lens of your perception. And we can't keep going back and forth, because that's not how this works. So what you're describing is a mind that is not practicing. It is not necessarily above the threshold of active recognition,
Right.
right? So
Right. That's where I say I'm like sorry to interrupt you, like Cypher in the Matrix, like, but I go back in. Like, Cypher.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah. And sometimes ignorance does feel like bliss. I get that. But ultimately, this is still, it's a trap of attention. It's below the threshold of.
But it's almost from, I just want to say, I'm sorry. It's almost from a place not of choice, though. I get it is all choice.
It's
and
not
I
coming
have
from a place of choice. It's coming from a place of habit. You're not choosing habit. Habit is occurring because of you're below the threshold of active recognition.
And then
Okay,
it's automatic.
Gotcha.
If you're not choosing where your mind is, where is it? It's going like a leaf at the mercy of the wind towards its most common habits, which is why that's one of the 4 destroyers. So I'm jumping ahead and giving you the example of somebody who's practicing all the time. They have accumulated personal power. They have all the information in the world that they need for everything. We have all the information. It's all organized. We're all good. When you drop habits, it's because of how it feels. You don't need to evaluate. I don't need to evaluate roasted chicken from fried chicken from gluten-free chicken because all chicken's gluten-free. It's like, what are we talking about at this point? It comes down to when you're in the hydrostasy practice, you feel the world around you. You feel your connection to the infinite because there's no interference. And so you feel imbalance. You feel yourself when you're coming out of balance, just like when you're surfing or riding a skateboard. You know what it feels like when you're losing your balance. Because you're in hydrostasy, implying that you're practicing all the time, at least one point of attention at all times, above the threshold of active recognition, you can feel what is interrupting your personal power. Because you feel it, you can emphasize it with your attention. And then you can feel whenever you're going away from it. I feel sometimes, I can give you examples of all of the habits that I've dropped.
Yeah, and you don't have to think.
I don't think about it. I feel it.
Exactly.
I can feel that this. And when I start to think about it, I know that I'm erroring. And I go back to the rule of 3 and I go back to my practice. And then there's other little things that I do, and this will be more appropriate to deliver when we talk about hunting power, because intention and will is what builds personal power. When we have the personal power built up, we know when it's time to go to grilled chicken or no chicken. We know when it's time to stop pursuing sexual intercourse with everybody that we know. When it's time to stop the human mating rituals. It's not necessary anymore. These things drop away. They're like apples on a tree that are no longer necessary. They're load bearing and they just fall to the ground. Does that make sense, Michael? I don't have to think about it. I don't have to try to understand it. There's nothing confusing about it. The habits that are out of proportion, that are out of balance, will be felt and you will drop it.
A clear channel, you can feel it. That's, yes.
What the world is trying to do is they're trying to use force. They're trying to control. They're trying to use hypnotism. They're trying to use all of these different forceful ways to change behavior, but they're not interacting with personal power through non-interference, because that requires much more. But there's freedom in what I'm talking about. Does that make sense, Michael, at least intellectually? But we can't keep going back and forth in examples to practicing in hydrostasy or not practicing.
No, it does.
That's a great point with the practicing, because it's you're already in that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I'm almost thinking of like the roots of a plant. Like you need to be like working with water down through the, like, not just jumping around. Like there's no hydrostasy going on because I'm not staying rooted in one point of attention and the energy of it.
Exactly. So I won't even talk about behavioral change outside of this type of setting. Like if you wanted to talk about it in a one-on-one, we don't even need to talk about it. There's no point, because there's no hydrostasy occurring. So the only
okay, sorry. Go ahead. I'm interrupting you, but Is hydrostasy total and complete, or can you do it sometimes?
No, hydrostasy is maintaining a point of attention all day long. You're either doing that or you're not. It does take time, which is what warrior training is designed to do. So in basic alignment, you're forgetting all the time. In counterbalance, you're forgetting more than you're remembering. In warrior training, you're remembering more than you're forgetting. And in hydrostasy, you remember your points of attention all the time. That's very cut and dry.
That's a good way to put it, Ernest. Yeah.
If you're forgetting your points of attention, go back to warrior training. You're not in hydrostasy. We're not ready for that yet.
That's right. Wow.
But here will be the ultimate result of hydrostasy, and I think this will be good for today. But there are some things that can occur with hydrostasy. So Michael, do you know how, and I know you know this, when we're in the Shavasana, or when we're listening to Eckhart Tolle or Wayne Dyer, these fun people to listen to, they talk about the abstract nature of our experience. And abstract just means that it's not easily demonstrable to other people. Your imagination is abstract to another person because they don't see it until you put it on a painting or put it into a picture, and then it becomes more actual, active. So abstract is the silence behind the sound, the space behind the object, the stillness behind the movement. You have sampled that, right, Michael? I'm assuming yes. I'm assuming that you have sampled that. You have felt that.
Yes.
Hydrostasy will put you in balance to where you're able to perceive the moment as it occurs and the abstract at all times. Does that make sense? The abstract can become one of your points of attention that you maintain all throughout the day. That is one of the ultimate, I don't want to say goals necessarily, but it will be one of the results. One of the fruits of the hydrostasy practice is being able to engage and maintain the abstract, our connection, and that's all felt. It's a feeling. So sometimes we would talk about feelings like, and Shana and I really like this one, but the artist's edge. You know, when you're walking and you kind of feel it's quality, it's caring about them. And hydrostasy, the practice of Qigong will help set this up. So you'll be able to access this really easily if you do the Qigong practice from beginning to end.
And that's why you can become adaptable in the moment without thinking.
Bingo. Yes.
Yeah.
So that is one of the ultimate results of hydrostasy, is to be balanced with the physical and the non-physical, the seen and the unseen, the present moment as it's occurring and the abstract as it's occurring. Now, the abstract we won't talk about.
How do you balance self and other with no self and no other? That's a tricky one for me.
Well, we're not
when you draw that picture with the laminar flow and the thing going through it, I think of the tube itself as my person.
That's where thinking gets in the way again.
It's thinking about
the more permeable. Like I feel that this concept of self becomes more porous. My concept of other becomes more porous. It's almost
but
like
those are thoughts, Donna.
Well, hold on. And
I'm just trying to describe a feeling.
Yeah.
That when I'm practicing, that the concept of self isn't just a balance between the non-self. It becomes more permeable. I don't know how else to describe it. I am a human. I am a human living on the planet. So there has to be some concept of self, right?
Right. No. Can I just explain real quick? Because I get your question. So
sure.
Concept is a thought exercise. It requires thought. The concept itself is a form. We create concepts so that we can communicate our experience to other people. What happens in hydrostasy when you have the balance between dualities, infinite, finite, and individuality, and our connected aspect. So the universe, we're all one, man. True. But in hydrostasy, we balance what looks like opposites. We're also individuals. And this is a feeling. So there's no confusion when you're feeling both the individual experience and the connected experience simultaneously. What other practices, I use that word very loosely, they're usually just like ideologies or cult mentalities. They want to go from one extreme to the other. Will deny the individual self, not the concept. I'm not talking about the concept. We don't need concepts of self because I have to travel to you. That's not a concept. Like that's a physical thing. Like we're separated by space and time, what we view as space and time.
Yeah, I know. Poor choice of words, but you know what I meant.
Yeah, so no concept necessarily, but when we're in hydrostasy, we can feel both simultaneously. And when you feel both simultaneously, it creates a third thing called balance. The hydrostasy effect. So when I walk through my day, I have individual Ernest connected to the totality of the human experience, the entire human race, all living things, all non-living things. The two are kept simultaneously, and then that balance occurs. We're not trying to deny one so that we can indulge the other. So it's not like we completely deny this self so that we can pretend that there's nothing but connection and there's both.
Yeah, it's all duality. It's like there's no flow without ebb. So
exactly.
Right.
Bingo. Yeah. So, but the concepts, when we try to go back to concepts and thoughts, that will confuse the shit out of us because we're trying to explain the unexplainable in a manner of speaking. Like we can share something to describe to help communicate the feeling, but you can't explain something that is non-tangible.
Oh, that's great. I understand what you're saying. That's where no words can quite
Exactly.
come in. Yes, now I get it.
And then when we try to put words to it, when we try to put words to it, Karen, we end up with some wild shit.
Yes, that's what I realized there, because there are no words. That's what I get a little chuckle out of it, of being aware of that.
So that's why I have what I call the abstract principles, because I don't want to divide the abstract up. I'm not trying to control the abstract. The principles just help you stay in it. Does that make sense? And I have not shared the abstract principles in any detail yet. That's a part of the hydrostasy practice. And I haven't really shared that much about how to hunt power. Those are parts of hydrostasy that I should only share when a person's doing it. Otherwise, it could technically become disadvantageous because there's no understanding. It's all doing. You don't need to understand anything. Trying to understand is a habit that we will hopefully address in warrior training.
That gets in the way, actually.
And so ultimately, we're looking for balance between contextual opposites, and then they dissolve. They become a third thing, power. Does that make sense? And not power over other people, personal power, knowing. And then sometimes if you have enough personal power, you end up with words to describe what's occurring. That's how I do it. The way that I'm able to describe everything that I'm able to describe is a result of one thing, personal power, because I put myself there. If I were quasi practicing and I wasn't really doing it, I would be coming up with some hot bullshit. And it wouldn't be as consistent and it wouldn't have the thread of continuity that what we're creating here does. But here's the big kicker. And Michael, this is for you. So ultimately, hydrostasy will help you accumulate personal power, which will lead to all the behavioral change in the world. You'll constantly be updating and evaluating because you're still creating habits. We don't go to the extreme of no habit whatsoever. No, the brain is designed to do that. It's going to create, but because you have so much cognitive attention and you have impeccable self-awareness, habit can't get out of balance with you. Does that make sense? So we won't be creating new habits that we have to uncreate. But we've maybe had 30 or 40 years of unconscious accumulation of habit. So it may take some time for these things to naturally drop away, and that's okay. You're not trying to control anything. It's not like you have to be vegan because you think it's better. Tell that tribe of Eskimos that live off of one whale and their entire civilization is based on that one whale that they should be vegan. It's just a way of looking at things. There's no absolute right or wrong to eating meat or not eating meat. Okay. Now, here is the final result that I want to share with hydrostasy. And it is something, and I'll save this whiteboard. And then, are you paying attention, Michael? Because this is for you. I mean, it's for the group, but This is the lens of perception. The lens of perception for most people in the world today is full of thought bubbles. Trying to control, trying to figure it out, labeling and judging, comparing, contrasting, self and other. So all of everything that's going into our lens of perception is being affected by these bubbles, and therefore everything coming out is affected by these bubbles. Why do you want that Ferrari? Again, nothing against Ferraris, it's just a consistency of example. It's because of that thought bubble. It's because of that below the threshold of active recognition habit that has accumulated, that you think you need this to complete yourself, or maybe you think you look cooler, or you think you can drive faster, which is infinitely more dangerous. Maybe not infinitely, but exponentially more dangerous.
Or it's just been on your bucket list.
Sure, yeah. Does that make sense, Michael? This is what human cognition looks like in the human experience today. Does this make sense, group? Michael, everyone? Now, I use two different words when I'm talking about this. Eventually, through our practice, we will clear our lens of perception from those thought bubbles. And now everything coming in will be crystal clear to everything going out. This is called balance. This is the hydrostasy effect. But one thing that we can do as human beings is we can change this lens of perception at will. That is the ultimate act of hydrostasy. And I use two different words: modulation and shift. Modulating your lens of perception is relatively easy to a certain extent. We do it all the time, whether we know it or not, habitually. You can do it with drugs, alcohol, scenarios. You won the Super Bowl. Okay, that's a form of lens of perception that has changed your lens of perception. And it may be relative to winning the Super Bowl. It may be conditional, right? I don't know. I have never won the Super Bowl. So that is called a modulation. Does that make sense? We modulate our lens of perception. No, even winning the Super Bowl is just a modulation. It's not a shift. So when I wake up, I will modulate myself to appreciation. If you take a drug, it may modulate you to relaxation. Alcohol sometimes can relax you before it doesn't. But small amounts of alcohol can relax your muscles, and sometimes that's why people do it, is to find a little relaxation. That has modulated your lens of perception. The world is using all of these exterior means to modulate their lens of perception. And when you modulate, it changes how you feel. Does that make sense? Thinking is modulating your lens of perception, whether you know it, like it, or not. Every thought has a derivative that slightly modulates your lens of perception. The way that you assemble and accumulate and organize, recognize your environment, inner and outer environment, and even the abstract environment. Does that make sense? Those are modulations. You can modulate your lens of perception at will. In hydrostasy, you're doing that all the time. And then comes a shift. We don't talk a lot about a shift because we haven't had the questions asked. But to be able to shift your lens of perception at will is the ultimate act of hydrostasy and the ultimate act of Igong. And it is very difficult to describe. But one thing that you can shift your lens of perception to, the abstract quality of the present moment. That's not, now you can modulate there to a certain extent, thinking about the space behind the sound. But there is a feeling of momentum that can occur as a result of the hydrostasy practice. That feeling of momentum is what? I just talked about it. Personal power. The feeling of momentum is the feeling of accumulated personal power. You feel it in your stomach, and you feel it in your whole body, and you feel it in the whole field of perception eventually.
This is great you brought this up too, because somebody in a group I was in just said, how can you be in the moment when you could just take a mushroom and get high, and you just described it.
Well, you can, and
Oh, you can shift it. I
you
mean,
can
not
shift
shift,
it.
but modulate.
you can definitely modulate it, but you can't you can't actually shift it.
No, you can't. That's the difference.
No, hold on, Karen. Just so I can clarify, you can shift your lens of perception with a drug, but it would be something like ayahuasca or peyote or something like that. And you didn't do it with intention and will. Therefore, it has a different quality. Does that make sense?
Okay,
That's the
yes,
difference.
that makes lots of sense.
Yeah. So the only difference in the shift of perception, you can have a shift of perception if somebody that you really care about, that you've been with your entire life, transitions to something new. That could cause a shift in the lens of your perception. Modulation is a little thing that we do throughout the day. A shift is monumental.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense too, Ernest. Thanks.
But the difference in what we're doing is it has the flavor, the feeling of personal power, intention and will, purpose.
Oh, see, this whole explanation is makes me understand what hunting power is now, which
There we go.
is elusive to me
Yes.
before.
So Michael, if you're practicing hydrostasis, and I don't want to give a bunch of personal examples, I'll give them if you ask them, but I don't want to give this vibe that Ernest is perfect, because I have habits that are like apples and they're getting heavier and heavier and heavier. They don't feel good, and eventually they'll just fall like the other ones have. So I'm not going to put myself on a soapbox and say, I no longer leave the towel on the bed. Well, that's true. But I don't want to start keeping score and pretending that I'm better than other people, because I will always be dropping habit, because I'll always be creating habit. So it's a process that there's no getting there.
I'm glad you brought that up too.
And you'll
That's
always
important.
be cleaning your lens of perception.
Yes, to a certain extent, yes. It's not getting as dirty, so it requires less cleaning, but I will always be creating a habit. And then when that habit is starting to go outside of the circle of hydrostasy, I'll feel it and I'll be able to correct it and drop it. Does that make sense? So that's where all the behavioral change occurs. And that's where something occurs that is so rare in the human experience that there's nobody talking about it. And that is deliberately, intentionally, and willfully using personal power to shift your lens of perception. And I have shifted my lens of perception to the abstract quality of the present moment.
Oh, I like the way you use the words in that. Willfully, yes.
I do it on purpose because I want to, because that balances between literal and non-literal, physical and non-physical, infinite and finite, known and unknown. And then that's where even more personal power comes from that. So in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, I'm going to continue to add to the examples of habits that I've dropped, habits that I've caught and redirected before they gained the momentum. And, you know, it will look how it looks. I won't go around bragging about it because of how people perceive that type of thing.
Oh, that's a great point too there. People, yeah.
They view it as like soapbox preaching or virtue signaling. And I don't tell a lot of lies. I don't remember the last lie that I told. Why do I need to? I'm not trying to defend myself. There's no self to defend.
Well, that's interesting you brought that up, because I was speaking with others and use those exact same words. There's nothing to defend anymore. I'm free. Exactly.
So that's just an example. But if you go, why do I need to be angry? Well, I don't need anger. Anger doesn't occur to me anymore. But if you tell somebody that, they'll think that you're an alien, or they'll think that you're trying to, you know, whatever.
They think you're trying to be, like, oh, I don't. Yeah.
Or they try to make you angry to prove you're wrong.
Yeah. What were you saying, Shana?
They think that you're trying to be perfect.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly, Shana. And then they get angry.
Or they get angry that you're not angry.
Exactly. And they try and make you angry. It's so.
So that's the spoiler alert. When you practice hydrostasy, when you are maintaining at least 1 point of attention, which leads to 4 points of attention, and then you start to shift your lens of perception, you can now have points of attention that are abstract. I have up to 8 points of attention simultaneously throughout my day. It's very difficult to trigger me. I don't really respond to things the way that other people do. It looks like patience. It looks like control. It looks like discipline. I say looks like because
sometimes it looks like indifference.
Sometimes it looks like indifference. Yes. And there are some qualities that we'll talk about that do require explanation when it comes to something that I call deliberate folly. I use deliberate folly in interacting with other people. And Michael, we cannot do deliberate folly until we have gaps in the overall amount of thought, which is hydrostasy, which is why I don't talk about it before that. All right, questions, comments, or concerns? We did jump ahead a little bit in the discussion. We did still cover the topic, which was the traps of thinking, but we also got into the gist of hydrostasy, what it is, what its ultimate goal or fruition will be. Number one, balance, and balance equals personal power. That's the bottom line. Why can't you put things into words? You need to not accumulate, but you need more fluid ebb and flow of energy between infinite and finite. You need less interference. That's a good way to put it. You need less interference. So ultimately, the practice equals balance, which equals personal power. And then with enough personal power, you can explain anything, you can do anything, and you can shift your lens of perception at will. That requires personal power to do, which is why sometimes I don't talk about it, because although we can modulate to the abstract quality, to shift requires to shift without substances and without circumstances requires personal power. Once the personal power is there, behavioral change is just a thing. Like that's easy. What are we talking about now? But with enough personal power, you can now shift your lens of perception. And when you shift your lens of perception, Michael, where do problems exist? Where is trying to control? Where is trying to manipulate? Why do I need that career? Why do I need that Ferrari? Why do I need people's approval? Why
do I perceive people took advantage of me because I'm a nice guy? Because I was in that connected space, and then I got it's expectation. That's another trap of attention, is our expectation
that was one of them.
Of the way things were going to be. Yeah.
Expectations was one of them.
Yep. I added it in the chat, but you didn't see it.
Oh, I didn't see it. Yep.
Michael made me think of it when he was talking about I can jump ahead to being in that space and then people take advantage, and then I go, oh, look what happened. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I could be too nice a guy, and then people take advantage of me, and that's not exactly what you're talking about. Because people taking advantage of you has a level of expectation attached to it, or attachment. Self and other, self and other, self and other, self and other. Yeah.
And communicating about this is quite different than communicating about the practice. So I see what you're saying, definitely.
And with enough practice, there is gaps between the overall amount of thought, which means that you can eventually just turn it off. Of course, you're not turning it off, you're doing something else.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Thank you for that.
And when we can shift the lens of perception, we are determining our state of being. And why do you need exterior? You can still do exterior things because you still have desires, but your desires are closer to intelligence. And then before you know it, we're getting into what some people want to call, but don't really understand, authenticity.
Thank you so much for going into all this today. Really appreciate it, Ernest.
Through practice, one of the things that I noticed is that human attention is ageless. It's shared, and it's the only thing arriving in the present moment, that you can perceive, in a manner of speaking. Your body is in the present moment, but I'm going to perform an action. It already happened by the time my mind has perceived it. Very tiny little time gap, right? Like it's not a lot of time elapsing from movement to recognition. Light entering my eye, to recognition and processing. Sound entering my ear very fast. I recognize it and process it very quickly because we have a remarkably fast brain, but it does require time elapse. Your attention is interacting with the present moment presently. It's the only way that you can interact with the moment presently is with attention. The power of attention is vastly untapped.
Which is why you can adapt.
Which is why you can adapt. Exactly. And also you're not existing in an extreme, which makes adaptation easier for you. So if shit hits the fan, I'm probably going to adapt better than the people who are attached to their way of life or the way things used to be. See what I mean? And
Yes.
if the world were doing this, we would live in a completely different world. Everything would be different. We would lose words like perfect, trying to control. It's just, where are you in the stream of your evolution? That's it. Are you changing over time, or are you not changing so elegantly?
It's so freeing. I went for a walk yesterday because it was warm, and I've been trapped in my house with my isolation of COVID. And yesterday I did a bunch of stuff because I finally tested negative. And I was box walking and practicing, and I noticed my physical imbalance from the lack of physical activity. And it was really windy. And so I just recognized that my walking was, the quality of my walking was different than when I was walking more frequently. And I didn't feel the pull to judge it or to feel bad about it or to say, oh, look, I've lost strength or I've lost balance or I was just noticing the quality of my walking. And therefore, when I didn't lift my leg high enough for that bump and I misstepped, I didn't see it as an error. I just adapted to the fact that my body has a different level of strength today in this moment, in this walk, which of course changed during the course of the walk, just for my due to my attention on it. But it's a freedom of not going down a rabbit hole when there's such freedom in that. There's so much more available in that space because I'm not going to judge it, score it, try to have an expectation about where I want to get to. In the absence of all of that, there's such freedom of thought and less words.
Mm-hmm. But stuff like everything's alive. We're all one, man. How did we realize that? How did we come to know that? And then where does it go? So if we're all one, why aren't we feeling that all the time? If everything's alive, why aren't we seeing and feeling that all the time?
Those traps of attention.
And the interference. And so the shift of perception includes shifting to those things. I can feel the aliveness. I can see the aliveness because I'm giving it my attention. And so one of my favorite things to do is, because I've recognized that attention is timeless, it's ageless, and it's shared, and that time is imagination anyway, I can actually hold myself in the moment and still feel the past and the future at the same time. Now that is really difficult. I can't teach that. I'm not going to try to teach that. The abstract principles will help a person find their own modulation. This is one of mine. This is my favorite.
I felt that when
I'm so glad you brought that up. Thank you.
I felt when you asked me about George Washington, I felt that, like, I don't know, have a feeling about that, but it's not based on anything I was taught, because that's all conceptual.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that feeling of present, future, past, all occurring at the same time. Yeah, it's a feeling.
It's a feeling. Sometimes it can lead to an interesting imagination. Like, I can see the world before Chicago existed. I can see it as Chicago exists, the third largest city in the country. But then I can also see that someday this will all be underwater. or, land will be over it, or it'll be.
That was like the New York City thing yeah, that's what we were talking about earlier in class. Yeah. It's amazing though. I had those glimpses of
Sure.
feeling when I was a kid.
Oh yeah. These can all be glimpsed. And then through personal power, we can shift. And then the whole practice is helping us modulate. So deliberate modulation is a technique in hydrostasy, and so is sensing energy, and so is the act of adaptation or the act of alignment. And then all of these, when you put them together, when you put all 6 of these techniques together, you have the ability to shift your lens of perception. And that changes everything. So much so that I can't talk about it because the world will firmly reject it.
Firmly, indeed.
Because they're too busy steeped in all of these. Ask me about my beliefs. That'll be a 5-second conversation. I put it on the island of maybe. Because I don't need beliefs. What do I need beliefs for? I don't need to believe. I have my attention. I see my attention. I see how I feel. I know how I feel. I don't need to believe a damn thing. Belief is not required.
It's interference.
It can be, absolutely. And it can also be a tool that helps you in the beginning. So, there's always ways to talk about these things, but we kind of jumped forward to the hydrostasy practice where none of that shit is necessary. And then, Karen, you've talked about kind of monitoring my behavior over the past few, you can see this. You can
yes,
see
I can see it
behavior.
very clearly, very clearly. It's, yes, very nice. I don't know the word. Nice isn't the word.
The bottom line is, it's not a hustle.
Yes, yes.
You see it. Yeah.
Yes, and then I have my own experience, and then but it's been very inspiring and yeah, very much so. I can see it.
All right, so that was the traps of attention. And then, so next Tuesday, topic number 9 is the 4 directions of attention, which is step 1 to hydrostasy. Step 1 to hydrostasy is we only enter the hydrostasy training when we're capable of maintaining a point of attention all day long, but then we'll learn to maintain 4 directions: external, internal, breath, and a form of cognition. The best form of cognition in the beginning of hydrostasy is imagination. Okay, I will see you guys on Thursday for the group study, and that's time for questions, comments, concerns. If you'd like to talk about any of this, let me know. I have space for one-on-ones on Sunday. So just let me know.
Sunday's the day. I was going to ask you.
I've been doing Sundays. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
It says Qigong, but I can do Qigong, Igong, either one is fine.
Okay, great.
And then Karen, to answer your question, so I start to introduce formal practices in Igong. Those formal practices are yoga or yin yoga, Qigong, and Tai Chi, and muscle activation, which I'm still working on myself, but.
Okay, excellent.
Yep, so I am okay with delivering Qigong by itself. I do that at the clinic sometimes, but ultimately Qigong for me is most important when we get into warrior training and we're really ready for some formal practices. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. The way we've been doing it.
And the reason that formal practices are so beneficial is because it's intention and will builds personal power.
Yes, and I've been doing them on my own. The actual practices, the Qigong.
I'll give things that are a part of the Igong practice, but you can take those principles and do it yourself. That's the bridge.
Yes, it is a bridge, and I could use that in the Qigong practice as well. Yes, that's the beautiful thing.
The way that I share Tai Chi, Qigong, and everything else will be with Igong, because it's the same point of attention. When I do Tai Chi, I have my bubbles of perception, I have my points, I have the golden line, I have everything that I'm doing informally. I'm just doing it now formally. There's really no difference for me.
There really isn't, now that I'm doing, both of them. I really see that and feel it. And it's quite helpful, actually. So thank you for pointing that out.
You're welcome. And then in just a couple of weeks, we'll have the Igong book. And then a month after that, we'll have Counterbalance. And then we'll see how it goes from there. but those will be ways for you to practice specifically, as opposed to the bridge, which is, very principle based, very dynamic for the individual. Qigong is a reflection of the bridge mindfulness system, but you can add and take away. Well, you can add all you want to. If you take it away, it's not Qigong. It's.
Oh, thank you, because you just answered my question. I don't even have to ask you. So that's perfect. Thanks.
Yep. All right. I will see you guys on Thursday if you can make it. If you're interested in Sunday, just let me know or go on to Shen Shen's website and sign up for Sunday. Okay. All right. I'll see you guys later. Bye, everyone.
Bye.